Thanks very much, Karen, and thanks to everybody for coming along and for having an interest in this. As Karen said, my name is Jim Lawlor. I'm one of the directors of the Native Woodland Trust. The trust was set up quite some time ago, nearly 20 years ago, to try and address the loss of what we call ancient woodland, and I'll get into what that means in a little bit in a few slides' time. Just to give you all a heads up as well, I have a bit of a cold, so I may not be able to talk this fast the whole way through. So if I go beyond 20 or 25 minutes, apologies. What I want to talk to you all about today is our original woodlands. What did they look like? Where were they? How much of it was there? What was the biodiversity like in there? The loss of them, what really happened, and how did we really lose all of our woodlands? And we may explode a few myths along the way there. Then I'll have a little talk about what's left, the threats that continue to cause issues with those very few woodlands that we have left, and what's left that we can do. What can we do as citizens? What can we do as a nation to do something about the complete lack of native woodland that we have in the country? And I'll just give you a few examples then of some work that we ourselves have been undertaking to try and preserve some native woodlands and to try and expand them. So our original woodlands covered more than 80% of the surface of the country. So even up to the tops of the highest mountains. So if you go to, say, Lugnaquilla in Wicklow, you'll see just bare peat and heather everywhere. But a couple of feet down, a meter down, there are stumps of trees. So the trees up to the tops of the mountains, right down onto the seashore, as you can still see in some places in Ireland, and really only raised bogs and open water were the only places where we didn't have trees or forest of some sort. And again, there's a perception that we feel that oak woods are natural woods, but actually, right across the Midlands, elm probably was the dominant tree. But we would have had, we've over 40 species of trees and shrubs, depending on how you define them. And we would have had something far more like the Scottish pine forests that you see in the Highlands today: Scots pine, birch, sessile oak, and rowan in very kind of open woodland settings in the mountains. So a lot of variety of woodlands out there, and a lot of variety of species, different mix, different dynamics. And the woodlands were a big part of our cultural identity as well. So, you may have seen the Ogham alphabet, where letters of the alphabet, the old Gaelic alphabet, were actually twinned with different trees. And we also had some of the earliest written, effectively, conservation laws in the world, which were the 8th century Brehon laws. And in there were the laws of the neighborhood. They divided the different species of trees into the same sort of social structure that our people had at the time. So there were nobles, the aristocrats, the lower orders, and the commoners. And these were based on the importance of the trees to people, from everything from spiritual importance through to use for building materials or food. So, the woodlands weren't a mystery to Gaelic people even over 1,000 years ago. They were very, very well understood, and they were very, very well used. So, they were used and cleared in prehistory. As soon as people needed to graze cattle or to grow crops, they were clearing trees. And coppicing was a very early form of management. This involved cutting the trees down to the base and allowing them to grow back. When those trees grow back from the base, you get multiple, much smaller stems. And that's much easier to manage. If you want to burn for charcoal and you to cut the wood up into small pieces, it's much easier to cut up 10 small stems than one absolutely massive one, which would require a massive amount of labor. It also meant that those stems could be used for creating wattle and daub, fencing, that sort of stuff. So even, the Irish name of Dublin's Ballaclia, the ford of the hurdles, those hurdles were probably made from woven hazel or willow. And we see that in the old Viking remains that are found around the country. That's how many of the walls were made. So coppicing was clearly going on well over 1,000 years ago. And in terms of the biodiversity then, we had bears, we had brown bears, pretty much the same species as the grizzly bear in North America now. We had wolves right up to the end of the 1700s. We almost certainly had lynx. There's a single remain from one cave of a lynx bone, but it only makes sense that they would have actually reached here. Wild boar were well known here. There was even a different Irish name for boar as opposed to a domestic pig, so torque for a boar and muck for a pig. There are references in sort of 17th century and earlier documentation to the great Irish owl, which is quite possibly an eagle owl. Did we have wild cats? It makes sense that we would have. So we had a lot of predators, we had a lot of big animals out there, and we'd really, really biodiverse woodlands. And some of the myths around those woodlands, they weren't all oak, as I've already mentioned. Wych elm was probably a far more common tree over an awful lot of the surface of the country. The woodlands were not cut down for the Royal Navy or to build the roofs of London cathedrals. There was one particular cathedral, and then was always quoted, and somebody actually tested the wood and proved that it had come from England and parts of the Baltic. So, you know, the timber we had here by the time, say, Cromwell arrived, and Cromwell and Raleigh did not cut all down the woods, you know, wasn't necessarily of great quality for these kind of structures and for boat building and so on. So that's not what happened to our woodlands at all. And one other thing that we often hear is, you know, we've got very little woodland left, but there's loads in Britain and Europe. So why do we have to worry about preserving Irish woodlands when on a European scale, there's plenty left? Our woodlands are not the same. We have a completely different species mix. We have species of trees in Ireland here that don't grow in Britain, for instance. We have our own unique species of trees here, and we've got a completely different dynamic because we have major tree species like lime, like sycamore, like beech, hornbeam, that are not native here. So different trees fulfill different ecological niches here. So the reality of the loss of our woodlands, most was lost to agriculture. So even if you look back at some of the old Gaelic tales and the cattle raid of Cooley and things like that, you know, cattle was a big part of our economy, really in ancient times. And an awful lot of woodland was cleared for cattle grazing. And people had to survive. Farming wasn't as intensive as it is now, so it was far more spread out. And Oliver Rackham, who was a great academic in Cambridge University, calculated that for every Iron Age hill fort that we could still see out there, every fairy fort, if you actually added them all up and divided the surface area of the country, there was one of those for every approximately 500 acres, even as far back as the Bronze Age. So the country was really widely populated with, you know, a very diffuse population, and everything was being utilized as best they could. So there was, you know, even thousands of years ago, the woodlands were being impacted by people, and that would have been the same all over the world. So the loss certainly started in prehistoric times. It certainly accelerated after the arrival of the Normans, excuse me. And by the mid 1600s, best estimates put the amount of woodland left at absolute maximum of 8%. So, and probably far, far less in most counties. So the records on which this is based don't exist for everywhere in the country. But that gives you an idea. You know, it's easy to blame somebody else for the loss of our woodlands, but the reality is, you know, just under 400 years ago, we were already down to 8%. And that's already less than almost every other European country still has today in terms of their original woodlands. And just to address that other last myth about the Irish woodlands are, you know, they're not of particular importance, even in a European context. One thing is that most of our woodlands would be temperate rainforest. So we have very, very high levels of rainfall in this country, and it's spread across the entire year. So you tend to have luxuriant growth actually on the trees, mosses, ferns, and temperate rainforests on a global scale is a relatively rare habitat. You'll get it on the west coast of Canada, you get it across a lot of Japan, the west coast of Britain as well, obviously, in Wales, Scotland, and places like Cornwall. But at a global level, it's quite a rare habitat. We also have a lot of Lusitanian species. So especially in the southwest of Ireland, we have species like the strawberry tree, the kerry slug, that, you know, have a kind of a fractured distribution. That they typically should belong in Spain and Portugal or the Mediterranean, but they actually grow wild here in Ireland. And it gives us a unique mix. So we have a temperate rainforest made up of Atlantic oak mixed in with strawberry tree, which you won't get anywhere else in the world. There are also lots of work has been done in recent years. The more DNA tracing becomes available to us and the more research can be done into it, it actually shows that the original convention about the source, the origin of our trees, was that after the Ice Age, trees basically migrated across Europe through Britain and into Ireland before the Irish Sea filled in. But actually what we're finding is that a lot of our wildlife, from our brown bears to our oak trees, appears to have originated in Spain or the Iberian Peninsula. And the sense that makes is probably that as the ice retreated, the coasts, which were much further out to sea than they are now, because obviously a lot of the water was locked up on ice, the coasts thawed out first, and that allowed migration up what was the western coast of Europe. So when we look at the maps now and we see the Bay of Biscay and the English Channel and the Irish Sea, we think of that as being an impossible route. But actually, 10,000 years ago, most of that was bone dry. So there's a lot of theories about how all of this fits together, but the reality is that, we have species that have been alone on this island effectively for most of the last 10,000 years that have originally evolved pre-Ice Age on the Iberian Peninsula or in other refuges in the south. So, we have a unique genetic mix here, and we don't fully understand everything. So we should really be taking the precautionary principle about this. And then just the last very quick thing to mention is we actually have two species, at least, of tree, which are unique to Ireland. One is the Irish whitebeam, whose population probably numbers in the thousands at most, a few thousand. Never find them in very large numbers in one place. And the other one is actually one of the rarest trees on the planet. It's called Scannell's whitebeam. It's only found on one rocky island in a lake in Killarney National Park, and there's probably only about individuals. Whitebeams are a strange tree. They can self-fertilize. So if they evolve a genetic mutation, they can effectively clone themselves. The mutation carries on, and if it's advantageous, the species perseveres, and that's presumably how the Irish whitebeam arose. So to give you an idea about the original woodland, and apologies for the fact that the north is excluded from this map, but that's the map that was available to us based on Irish data. So all of Ireland covered in woodland, except, as I said, open water and raised bogs pretty much, and except for maybe the tops of the highest mountains where it's just scree, like the Sugarloaf and Wicklow and places like that. And that's what it looked like today. And what I will say is even the marks that you see here are exaggerated to show the spread of woodland in the country, the spread of what we call ancient woodland, which is woodland that predates 1660, and long established woodland, which is woodland that was been found on the earliest 19th century maps. So we're not talking about thousands and thousands of year old woodland or original woodland stretching back to the Ice Age. We're talking about woodland that's either 200 years old or 400 years old. That's all. And these red dots that you see on here, as I said, are exaggerated in most cases, because at this scale of a map, they wouldn't be visible if we put them at their true size. So that's how much of our original woodland, or woodland that is descended from our original woodland, is actually left. And, what would those woodlands have looked like? Obviously, there's lots of biodiversity that's lost that we can't tell you that existed because it left no trace. But we know a lot of big animals did. We lost our brown bears. We lost our lynx. We also lost wild boar, and we lost lots of birds of prey. Now, there are organizations in place at the moment that are bringing back, you've probably seen eagles and red kites. Ospreys are starting to stray back into the country on migration between Africa and Britain. And cranes have bred again in Ireland for the first time in, I think it's over 400 years. And again, from a growing British population that has started to spread out. But we've lost other birds of prey. We probably had eagle owls. We had goshawks. Goshawks, again, there are small numbers of breeding birds in Ireland, but they appear mostly to have been escapes from falconry. So anything that we've gotten back, has been reintroduced either here or in a neighbouring country. We lost our big birds of prey. We lost our capercaillies, possibly as late as the 19th century. The capercaillie is a large bird, about a metre tall. It's like a turkey. And the Irish name for it is the horse of the woods, Clop on the Culia, because of the sound it makes during breeding time. Sounds like the clop clop of horses' hooves. We've lost those. And then, of course, we've lost our wolves. The old Irish name for wolf was Moch Tura, which means the son of the land. Again, culturally and everything else, it was really, the Gaels, the Irish, hunted wolves, but never tried to make them extinct. But then, after the Cromwellian invasions, there was a deliberate campaign to wipe out wolves. There are really, really heavy bounties on wolves. And even that there are records in the port of Bristol in England that show the import of wolf skins. And from that, it's been able to extrapolate there were probably at least 1,000, if not thousands, of wolves in Ireland still in the 1600s. But by 1785 is the kind of the last wolf killed story, which is on Mount Leinster in County Carlow. So we lost all those big animals. But those are the big animals that people would have written about, that would have left traces behind. But you can't lose, 99.75% of your woodland or of any habitat without losing an awful lot of the biodiversity that's associated with it. And that's what we've lost at best. Woodlands are our most biodiverse terrestrial habitat. It supports the most range of species. It would have supported the highest biomass of different species. And we also have some mysteries there that, that don't have answers, particularly at the moment. There were a lot of species that are common in Britain that are missing from Ireland that logically you would say, especially as they're airborne, should be here. So, we've lost our ospreys. We knew about that. We've lost goshawks, as I've mentioned. We lost all 3 species of woodpecker. And the reason we think all 3 were here is that there are records of them from a taxidermist in County Dublin, or in Dublin City, I should say, right up into the 19th century. And with the exception of the great spotted woodpecker, the other 2 species, which is the lesser spotted and the green, don't tend to move around a lot. So it's very unlikely that stray birds would have dropped into Wicklow or somewhere in the summer or winter on migration to be shot and stuffed. So, there's a very high likelihood we had all 3 species of woodpecker. We don't have nuthatch. And with the exception of a small kind of founding population in Currachase and Limerick, we don't have hawfinch, but the remains of hawfinch have been found in caves in Ireland. So we know they were here before. And this makes sense that we would lose a lot of species when we lose their habitat. And we have other species that are just only literally barely clinging on, like the pied flycatcher and the wood warbler. These are woodland specialists, and we're losing them now because we don't have enough woodland, and we don't have enough woodland of good enough quality. Because all of our woodlands, even the few that exist, they are still being disturbed by human activity. And they've all been modified by humans because we've always collected firewood and felled trees for construction and everything else. So I wanted to give you one example of the smaller species, the ones that didn't leave a trace. So St. John's Wood is 110 hectares of ancient woodland in County Roscommon. It's on a peninsula on a lake on the Shannon. And it's right in the middle of the country. It's not on a coast or the edge where species could come and go maybe a little bit more easily. And in 2008, a fairly detailed invertebrate survey was carried out, and they found 6 species new to Ireland. And what that implies is that those 6 species were probably in all of our woodlands, but only this woodland is of sufficient quality for them to have survived. And it just gives a little insight, even at the minute level, the micro level. We have undoubtedly lost all sorts of insects and other species as well. But this just gives us an insight, a small window into what might have been more widespread throughout the Western woodlands, but now has only survived in a single woodland in the country and was only found as recently as 10 years ago. So there are still discoveries out there to be made. So that's where our woodlands have been and where they are now. It was our original natural land cover over most of the country. We had a forests full of large animals and large predators, many of which we've lost. It was a part of our culture. It was reduced to 7 or 8% by the 1600s. And what we regard as ancient woodland, which is woodland that exists pre-1660, there might be as much as 0.25%, a quarter of 1%, but it's far more likely to be actually 0.1%. So 1/10 of 1%, which means we've lost 99.9% of those woodlands. And these are the last representatives of an ecosystem that's been isolated on this island for 10,000 years, up until people started to heavily modify them in especially the last few hundred years, planting woodlands themselves and importing species and stock from elsewhere. So what are the continuing threats to the woodlands? Even today, with all our environmental legislation and on the knowledge that we should have, what's still going on? But one of the biggest issues is those ancient woodlands are tiny. They're broken up into tiny little fragments across the country. Most are only 10 to 5 acres in size. So that gives you an idea of how random it is that they have survived. Overgrazing is a massive, massive issue. In some parts of the country, there's no grazing. It's not a problem, and that's great. But for large parts of, say, Killarney National Park, Wicklow National Park, there are fallow and sika deer in massive, massive numbers. There's probably more deer in Ireland now than there has ever been in history, because we have no predators left. They're not being culled, they're not being managed. It's a free-for-all. We have a site in County Wicklow of 20 acres around which we put a deer fence, and a couple of deer got in, and we cannot get them out, we cannot get rid of them, and we cannot grow trees in that site. That's how bad they are. And if you go to most of the woodlands in Wicklow, the ground flora that you see there is nothing compared to an area where there is no grazing. It's really, really severely damaged. It's preventing natural regeneration of the woods. And that's true right across Killarney National Park as well. So we have deer, and they're not native deer to this country. We have feral goats. We have domestic stock, particularly sheep that stray an awful lot. We also have deliberate damage, which is continuing. People are still felling woodlands. They are still setting fire to them. They're still cutting them for firewood. We've taken over recently an old woodland ourselves, an ancient woodland in the center of the country. When we bought it, it had been used to cut trees for firewood. It was actually advertised by the estate agent to say, yes, it's an SAC, but you can still cut it for firewood. All right, that's what we're up against. And of course, they're still being cleared for agriculture, regardless of what we may think, that, you know, all these old woodlands must be protected by now. They're absolutely not. Other issues are invasive species. Rhododendron and cherry laurel in particular. They invade these woodlands, they take over, they poison the very land, make it impossible for anything else to germinate underneath them, shade out everything else, and gradually take over. And we have other antisocial and other activities. We have arson. As we saw, some of you may have seen that the statue on the Greenway in Waterford recently, in the last couple of days, set fire to. We've had this on some of our sites as well. People absolutely going out of their way to try and burn the place down. Dumping, paintball, car rallies, all sorts of stuff like that. These all have an impact on the wildlife in those areas. And the example I wanted to throw at the very end of this, and it may sound very, very negative, but let's be realistic about the threats that still exist. Even Killarney National Park, it's a national park. It should be the most protected area in the country. Overgrazing happens. Domestic sheep are in there. There are too many deer. They are being set fire to. It's been in the news every spring and summer for the last couple of years that Killarney National Park's been on fire. It's full of rhododendron, you know, and if you go and visit large areas of Killarney National Park, as I did earlier this year with an awful lot of visitors, primarily from North America, you know, we recorded, I think it was 2 bird species singing in the woods, and outside the woods we recorded, I can't remember what it was, 10 or something. So, and the ground inside was bare, and there's no biodiversity, no great woodland flowers to show anybody. And you can see that natural regeneration isn't happening. Yet inside small fences, which the national parks have created in there as an example or as a test, inside fences, which are keeping out the deer and the sheep, there is the kind of insight into natural woodland there. Natural regeneration is happening. The ground is not bare. There are new trees and shrubs and other species in there waiting to take over when the mature trees fall. But for most of the rest of the place, when the trees that are growing there now die, there is nothing to replace them. So these are all really, really big issues, and they have to be addressed absolutely everywhere. So what's left? So I've taken these figures from Teagasc. So the figures you'll often hear about, you'll often hear 11 or 12% of forest cover in Ireland. That 11%, half of it belongs to Cuilja, which is fair enough. But 3/4 of that 11% is conifers, and only about 1/4 of it is broadleaves. So 1/4 of 11% is, let's be generous and say 3%. So 3% of our land, from an original 80% or more, has broadleaf trees on it. You can't even describe these as natural woodlands. It just happens to be broadleaf trees. Most of them have been imported. We don't tend to use native stock an awful lot of the time. We don't collect our own seeds in Ireland. These trees come in from abroad. That's how ash dieback, for instance, got into the country. Trees were imported from Holland, despite the fact we knew ash dieback was present in the country. There was no biosecurity measures taken. We allowed and continue to allow the import of these trees for no good reason. We have lots of good trees in this country. There's lots of seed to collect. It would create jobs, especially in rural areas. And nearly 3/4 of all of that is less than 30 years of age. So again, very, very young forests. Our ancient woodland, as I mentioned previously, maybe 1/4% of it left, far likely 1/10%, and possibly even less. And that's based on the ancient woodland inventory that was carried out in Northern Ireland, which identified every woodland down to half a hectare in size. And that was a really, really very comprehensive inventory that was undertaken. It employing everybody from historians and librarians to find old documentation to actually prove whether in a woodland that's there today was actually there all that long ago, because obviously not too many satellite photos from the 1660s. Yeah. And just to mention then that the National Park Service did do what they call an ancient and long established woodland inventory, where they tried to identify all these old woodlands, just dating from the early 1800s and back. It was never fully completed. And to be honest, it's completely full of holes. We started a citizen science project at the start of COVID that people could do a desk-based exercise to help us find woodlands, simply by looking at 19th century maps and today's satellite photographs and seeing our woodlands still on both. And anything that's on both would qualify as a long established woodland. And we just found them absolutely everywhere, but that they weren't on the inventory. National parks happily have now restarted that this year, and they've issued a tender and a company is working on it, and they're going county by county. So hopefully they're going to find them all, because one of the first things you have to do to be able to protect something is to know it's there. So this is a really, really important piece of work, and hopefully it'll be done soon. I just wanted to show you this as well. When I talked about native trees and the native tree forest cover, that 3%, this is often what it looks like. It's not a natural woodland. It's a single species stand of a commercial plantation. So this is an ash plantation that's about, I think, 30 years old. And it shows a lot of the damage that I've been talking about. For starters, it's a monoculture. So there's only one species. There's not a great variety in there. It's been grazed by sheep. So you can see the bottom meter of every tree, the bark is damaged. And there's nothing growing on the ground other than grass, because the sheep have eaten absolutely everything else. So sheep are in here in the winter, taken off for a couple of months in the summer to let the grass grow back, and then they're back in again. So, you know, that the 11% is not natural woodland, and the 3% broadleaves is not natural woodland. And it's not really, you know, it's not even approaching it in a lot of cases. In fairness, there are some great growers out there who've created broadleaf plantations that are close to nature, that are fantastic for biodiversity. And, you know, they're doing a fantastic job. But I just wanted to emphasize that that 3% is not a figure that any of us should have in our heads. We are not up to 3% natural woodland. This is what natural woodland should look like. And we have great examples of this. And some of those little scattered woodlands around the country that I mentioned, you know, that they're all fragmented in this 5 to 10 acres. This is what some of them will look like. And in here you can see there's a couple of large trees in the center, but most of the rest of it is small. We've got elm, ash, birch, oak. You know, there's a great variety of trees in there. There's spindle and guelder. You can't see them in the photograph. I just know because I took the photograph on it. I know what that woodland is like. And on the ground, in the foreground on the left, you can see what looks like a little kind of a hillock. That's where a tree has fallen. It's been windblown and it's pulled up the entire root plate. And behind it, it's left a hollow. And that hollow, when it happens initially, fills with water. It creates a temporary pond. You'll get fairy shrimp in it. You'll get all sorts of hoverflies breeding in there. But that's what the floor of a natural woodland should look like. It should be bumpy and lumpy and full of holes and hillocks and hummocks. And that's a great sign to see in a woodland, to show that people didn't continually go in and clean up all the fallen trees and straighten things out. And we have other fantastic woodlands. We all like to see the bluebell woods and the photographs and the one we used on our first slide there as well. But there's fantastic other species out there that will grow in profusion. The white flowers you see here are pignut. Very rare to see it in really, really big numbers. And this grows a little bulb under the flower, big favorite of badgers. So anywhere you find pignut, you'll often find holes dug by badgers because they've been eating the pignut bulbs. Obviously, we had to include a classic oak tree and bluebells in the spring. But one of the other things we don't think enough about is fungi. So fungi would actually represent a huge amount of the biomass in any given woodland. And some woodlands have fantastic, you know, variety and array of different fungi. And again, it's about the biodiversity. It's not just the pretty species. It's not just like the pandas and the cuddly stuff. Sometimes it's the ugly stuff. Sometimes it's wasps, and sometimes it's toadstools and mushrooms. And I just wanted to show you again an example of some of the small, tiny woodlands we have left. Not necessarily the big, huge ones, but this is the biodiversity you see in there. This is the scenery you see in there, and this is the structure of those woodlands as well. And you can really see the difference between these and that ash plantation I showed you. So there's a great difficulty for us as humans to try and recreate woodland, no matter what we do, no matter what variety of species we try and plant ourselves, no matter how randomly we try to plant them, we cannot recreate natural woodland the way it would arise naturally, the way Mother Nature would do it. So what can we do? Well, the first thing is we need to find every ancient and long-established woodland. We don't know where they are and what they are. We can't protect them. We need to actually put legal protection on those and on the ones we already know about. So an awful lot of the woodlands that were found before were left as proposed natural heritage areas in 1995, and they've never been designated. So the photographs I've just showed you, they're all from a small woodland called Arden in County Westmeath, and it's not protected. It's been a PNHA for over a quarter of a century and has received absolutely no legal protection. We should also find and protect and encourage new naturally regenerating woodlands. So if woodlands have arisen on abandoned land or the corner of a farm that's not used, that should be encouraged. Farmers should be compensated for that. They should not be losing out on farm payments and everything else for land that's not, that's not usable. I know some big changes have happened in that space recently, but we need to do more of that and allow more of that. Natural regeneration, as opposed to planting, is the best thing we can do from a nature perspective. And where possible, let's give the ancient woodlands we do find the space to colonize. Can we create buffers around them and allow them to spread out? Planted ancient woodland sites. So say, for instance, Coillte would have an awful lot of sites, and so would other landowners and other forestry companies, that were ancient woodland up until 50 or 100 years ago, and they've planted them with conifers. And while that's bad, what the experience has shown in the UK, especially in England, is that an awful lot of what we would feel is important about an ancient woodland has actually survived in the soil, in the seed bank under those conifers. And if you remove those conifers in a sensitive way and allow the place to regenerate, you can actually get back an awful lot of your ancient woodland, and actually species that haven't been seen, say, for instance, in a county in 100 years, they're still alive in the seed bank in there somewhere. So there's an opportunity to actually restore things, even though we may have damaged it 50 or 70 years ago. And the other thing we can do is use a lot more, not just native provenance, but local provenance seed and trees. We have no idea what genes have evolved locally in different places. You could go and look at oak trees in Kerry and then look at them in Glen of the Downs and County Wicklow, and you will be able to see physically different attributes to them. And that's probably represented in their gene bank. We don't know what we're losing by saying to ourselves, well, I'll buy oak trees in from France because I can get them at good quality and they're really cheap. Let's use our local stock an awful lot more. And I just want to give you an example. When I've talked there about ancient woodlands and what could still be alive in them, the biodiversity that we still have in them, which is fantastic. I mean, it's, the really, really fabulous woodlands out there. This is Arden wood, and the Native Woodland Trust manages this wood. And it's only 7 acres in size. So when I talked about the woods being really, really fragmented, this is it. That piece in the center is the top of a hill. So it's a flat topped hill. Where the woodland is growing is on the really steep sides. So it was never really practical to clear it for agriculture. And that's the only reason it survived. And this has actually been in the ownership of Westmeath County Council since before independence, since the early 1900s. And they've actually handed it over to us. Most of the photographs I showed you in the previous few slides of beautiful ancient woodland, they're from this woodland. This tiny little narrow fragment of woodland has all that fantastic biodiversity in it. And that's what it's looked like for at least the last 200 years. So when we look back at the maps going back to the start of the 19th century, it's the same outline. And it has survived absolutely by chance. It has definitely been cut in the past. There was even a proposal in the 1970s to fell it completely, but it was, it was kind of postponed and then forgotten about again. And this woodland contains 19 different species of trees and shrubs in this tiny little area. So it's fantastically biodiverse. And most of the trees and species that live in there, nobody would have planted. It's absolutely a completely wild wood. And what we've done is we've managed to raise the funding to buy all the surrounding land. And we're going to allow the entire thing to naturally regenerate and quadruple in size. And we're doing the same in Camcore Wood in County Offaly. And the small piece you see in the top left there, that's the only original part of that woodland. The rest of it was actually felled by a commercial forestry company and is now being restored under life funding. But this is actually the only original piece. We've bought the neighbouring land to allow it to double in size. We're doing something similar with St. John's Wood in County Roscommon, where we're allowing the woodland to extend into neighbouring land. And we actually have another site, hopefully, on on the way there as well. So there are great things we can do. We can allow these woodlands to expand. We can quadruple them in size. But just to put that in a very kind of careful context, even if we find every single ancient woodland left, and even if they are at their maximum extent of 0.25%, and even if we could do for them what we're doing for Ardenwood and quadruple them, you would still only have 1% of natural woodland naturally regenerated. So that just gives you the context and the scale of the task ahead of us. But it can be done. And when that naturally regenerating woodland regenerates, it can be fantastically diverse, especially if it has a nearby source of an existing woodland, which itself is already biodiverse. So in the bottom right-hand corner of this image here, this piece here has already begun to naturally regenerate. And it's full of different species. It's got Irish whitebeams in it. It's got purging buckthorns, species that the books will tell you won't be the first into new ground. But because it's so proximate to a very diverse woodland already, that's what we're seeing. And we haven't lifted a finger to do anything to influence that or anything else. That has just all happened naturally. So there's great scope out there for us to do lots and lots of things for our woodlands, to preserve their biodiversity, to extend them, to buffer them, to make them bigger and better. So what can we do as individuals as well? Well, one thing I will say is join your local conservation group if you can, or a branch of one of their organizations, or join one of the IEN groups. If you have time to volunteer, absolutely, please do volunteer. You can volunteer on the ground, go out and plant trees, or cut gorse or rhododendron, and there's lots and lots of groups out there doing that kind of thing. But there's other things you can do as well. Everybody has admin to do. Everybody has governance for charities that they have to achieve. That sort of stuff doesn't sound as nice and as interesting, but it still all has to be done. You can help people online and in the media and on social media. You can help to fundraise, or even if you have ideas or you spot opportunities that a group could exploit, or you find somewhere that needs to be saved and you need a group to help you, you're helping them in effect as well at the same time. So get involved is the big thing, absolutely. And the one thing I would say is when we set up the trust 20 years ago, we went to the UK and we spoke to a lot of the big organizations there, and we compared their memberships to the memberships of Irish organizations. And then we allowed for the big difference in population. At the time, the population of Ireland was, I think, 3.5 million, and Britain was nearly 60 million. But what we found was people in Britain were 20 times more likely to be a member of an environmental organization than an Irish person. And so it's the people power can make a huge, huge difference here, and make all the voices heard. Stand up for your local habitat, stand up for your woodlands, stand up for your biodiversity. That will make the biggest difference. And there's so many ways you can do that. But on a smaller scale as well, look to rewild your own garden and your community. So I recently had to move house. I inherited a garden that was just bare grass. And I allowed quite a large part of it to just go completely wild. And I can see absolutely tangibly the difference in insect numbers at night, the insects that come in through my window now that didn't come in a few years ago. Just the pure volume of insects, the plants that just grew out of that grass that looks like it's been a mowed lawn for 70 years, makes a huge difference, absolutely makes a big difference. So anything you can do, and to coin a terrible phrase from another corporation, every little really does help. Try and collect seed and grow your own trees and wildflowers from local sources. And I mean, everywhere has a local source. I have found orchids and yellow rattle and all sorts of species growing out of the edge of tarmac in industrial estates in Dublin. They're out there. Go have a look, keep your eyes open, see what you can find, and see what you can take from as close to your own locality as possible. And when you do buy trees or hedging or anything else, try and see if you can get Irish provenance, because that will encourage nurseries to stock more of it, and that will encourage them to collect more local seed. And again, that just keeps that gene pool alive and in the ground out there, and not in a museum or a seed bank. So look, that's as much as I can possibly say in the time frame. I hope I haven't gone too far over. But happy to throw it open to questions and answers now, and I hope I didn't bore you all or talk too fast.
No, thanks a million, Jim. That was brilliant. So if you'd like to raise your hand or use the chat function, I'm happy to sort of help with moderating and getting the questions read out. So there's one question from Linda Gilson, and if we know, if we know of a piece of land that might have ancient land, what do we do?
If it's ancient woodland, write to us So info@nativewoodlandtrust.ie. You should be able to find it on our website as well. Write to us and send us a Google Maps pin drop for it. That's probably as good a start as any.
Okay,
And we'll help you
thanks.
then in terms of if it should be protected, if it should be on the list that the ancient long-established woodland inventory is currently addressing as well, and if it's under an immediate threat. There's lots of other things that you can do to protect it. Tree preservation orders can be put onto the county development plan. You can't cut trees down without a felling license anyway, so the Forest Service will cover that. So we can canvass them to make sure they don't grant felling licenses for woodland that we think is actually ancient and should be protected.
There's a question from Katie. Well, also a comment. Great webinar. Thanks so much for sharing your time and your knowledge. Could this be made available online? Yes, we are going to make this available online. One question is there a list of ancient woodlands from around the country, Jim?
So there is, if you Google ancient and long established woodland inventory, you should be able to find the national parks. It's a PDF document, which will list everything that was found on the previous survey. It actually gives an awful lot of detail about the woodlands as well. And it actually scores them in terms of biodiversity, threat levels, all that sort of stuff. But as I said, that is by no means an exhaustive list. If you want to try and find old woodland in your own locality, one of the best things you can do is there's a website called www.geohive.ie, and you have to put in the 3 W's or it won't launch. You can see current ordnance survey maps, satellite photographs going back to the mid-1990s, and then you can also layer on maps going back to the 6 and 25-inch maps from the end of the 19th, start of the 20th century, and back to I think pretty much the start of the 19th century as well. That'll give you a good idea if any of your local woodlands that you're thinking about have actually been there all that time. Then there are other things you can do, I don't have something to hand, but we can probably put something together and make it available, maybe through yourself, Karen. I'll have a look. But there are lots of ways to identify what's a likely ancient woodland. So the boundaries tend to be irregular. They tend to have walls around them or some sort of protection, large ditches. If they've got large boulders or stones in them, it shows we weren't cleared for agriculture. A lot of species that we associate only with ancient woodlands. So once in the woodland that's cut down, these are the types of plants that don't get back in, plants and insects. They won't reinvade a woodland if you just plant one from scratch. So there are lots and lots of things like that that you can look out for as signs that a woodland is very old or ancient.
Thanks for that, Jim. Another question from Rebecca O'Flynn. When we know so much about the value of protecting our woodland, why has the government not done more? And do you think this is changing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think, I guess it doesn't win votes. Hasn't been a popular subject for a very, very long time. Quite frankly, nobody has cared, other than a very, very few people. So the knowledge hasn't been there. The understanding hasn't been there. We've probably believed our own marketing to an extent as well. Ireland's a great place, 40 shades of green and all that sort of stuff. And, it's only as we understand more and more about our biodiversity loss and the loss of actually the kind of connectivity of our habitats that we realize actually we're in a really terrible, terrible state. It is getting better, but it's getting better from a citizen and voter perspective. I don't see too many politicians changing their attitude. We still see ourselves, even in the trust, that regenerating woodland is a sign of farmland lost. Sometimes it's a sign of a family lost to a community because they've abandoned the farm. There's very old, maybe kind of famine era cultural connections to the land like that. We've had people threaten us for trying to plant trees or to allow areas to rewild. So there's still some quite old attitudes like that kind of say, view trees as bad or a sign of dereliction. And unfortunately, at a political level, until there's votes in it, there won't be finance in it, there won't be legislation in it. And one of the things we still see as well is, even in protected areas, I quoted Killarney National Park earlier, but, we have seen ancient woodland bulldozed and destroyed. And, if you've got 5 acres of woodland and that could be worth 50 grand as bare agricultural land, and you bulldoze it and you get fined 10 grand, you profited by 40. So we have to take this seriously. And the punishment has to fit the crime. And when you look at, say the likes of Archer's Garage in Dublin, which was bulldozed without permission. Not only was the owner and the builder fined, I can't remember which, so just, you may have to Google it, but they were obliged to put it back the way it was. And that's where the real penalty is, because you can't gain from it then, and you have to incur the cost of putting it back the way it was. So, if we regarded environmental crime in the same way that we regard kind of architectural crime, that would certainly help an awful lot.
Okay, thanks, Jim. A lot of questions and comments flying in here on the chat. Someone, Colette, has worked for the last 15 years on the British Columbia coast of Canada in a place we call the Great Bear Rainforest. She now lives in Westport and is campaigning for years against the cutting of old growth. Thanks, Colette. Another question, which I think you kind of covered, Jim, but just in case you wanted to add something to it, if there are laws to protect woodlands, why are they suffering so much? Is it a lack of interest or resources, or the usual Irish attitude to the law?
I would say all of the above. So we have seen instances where, protected sites have been damaged. We can't get the relevant authorities to take an interest in it. Can't get them to attend the scene. No particular training for the Gardaí in terms of environmental crime. In fairness to Gardaí, having spoken to one Garda recently, eight guards in a station for a densely populated city area and one car between them. I can understand why this is not a priority for them as well. I don't know if the proposed wildlife crime unit is going to help with that. But yeah, we're very, very soft on this kind of stuff, And so, yeah, I think it is the usual Irish soft attitude is a huge part of the problem, because most people know that if they do it, the chances of being caught are very low. The chances of being prosecuted are very low. And the chances of them getting any sort of punishment that's not water off a duck's back is also very, very low. And again, to give an example of that, we recently found, well, in the last year, a landowner bulldozing hedgerows right next to not only a protected area from a conservation point of perspective and environmental, but actually on a national monument zone in a field that's clearly full of archaeology. And we reported it to the National Museum and to the National Park Service. The National Museum never responded to us, so we don't believe anything ever happened. And half of that National Monuments zone was ploughed and reseeded. And then the national parks did their best, but they told us because they didn't actually catch the person in the act, they just caught them with a bulldozer and a big pile of dead trees. That's not enough evidence. They couldn't actually prosecute them. So, that's absolutely farcical stuff.
There's another question here from Patricia Doyle. If one wanted to plant a small woodland, what are the issues with planning permission, etc.?
So there's been changes to the forestry law so that you can plant, I think it's a hectare now, without any particular permissions. And you can plant, I think it's a 20-meter wide hedgerow. Now, I'm not sure how that latter one is going to work out, because any field in Ireland that's less than 40 meters across, you can claim has a hedgerow on each side and fill the whole thing in. But the limit in terms of actual local authority planning permission is really quite high. So if you're planting a few acres, it's not an issue. If you're planting more than about a hectare, you have to get a planting license from the Forestry Service. That's the big one. And then there's a huge process involved in that.
Okay. Someone has a question. I'm wondering, is there something to be done to save Merlin Woods in Galway from building a new road through it? There's no political support for this matter, unfortunately. And I believe it's ancient woodlands with conifer plantation.
Yeah, so I've seen the Merlin Woods campaign online quite a bit. They seem to have been quite a vociferous and active group, and they seem to have been, to be honest, very, very good. And I know that they have orchid-rich meadows and some, I think, karst habitat there as well. So this goes back to, the question a couple of questions ago, like why haven't we done more to protect our woods if we know so much about, their loss and the damage and everything else? And it goes back to the same thing. It's political will. It's votes. If you could lose your seat over a few votes, then you're not going to stop a hospital building a road or building new buildings on a site versus a far smaller number of environmentalists that want to object to it. So, and that brings us back to the original difficulty. These sites should all have been identified long before now. They should all have been designated. They should all have been given legal protection. And had they been given legal protection in the first place, chances are nobody would even have attempted to put through development in them in the first place. But what you're doing now is kind of chasing the horse after it's bolted. You know, they can push through a planning permission. It's not a designated site. It won't come up on any of the planning. It doesn't give you a rationale for the appeals or anything else. And you're now trying to retrospectively get something done about it. Like, I absolutely feel for them. That is just the nature of the political landscape in Ireland.
Just another question. With the Paris agreements or other, is there requirements to increase woodlands in Ireland? So just a question around whether there are requirements to increase woodland. Well,
so I know there certainly are proposals to do so. I guess my concern would be, and we need to see the details, is I'll go back to that slide I showed of the broadleaf plantation. It doesn't approach natural woodland. So if we are going to extend our woodlands, it is so much far better to extend them by natural regeneration as much as possible. Now, obviously, if we have 1/10 of 1% natural woodland left, and I should say semi-natural woodland, but our old ancient woodlands, there's only so many good sources of seed from which natural regeneration can occur. But you can see clearly the difference between natural regeneration and planted. So I guess I would be really anxious to see the detail of those proposals and how they're going to go about it. Natural regeneration doesn't cost anything. It doesn't need any inputs. It doesn't need humans. It just needs an absence of grazing and invasive species. That's all it needs. And it needs a seed source. So that can happen on a massive scale without anybody looking to transfer billions from the budget for it. So yeah, I don't believe there's an obligation on us. I believe there are some proposals to do it. And I'd really be anxious about what the details of those proposals will look like.
Okay, thanks, Jim. A comment from Mary: local property developer came onto my land, cut down trees illegally, guards did nothing, and the department did nothing, though both admitted it was illegal. Just to your point earlier about the lack of kind of resources.
Yeah, if it's on your land, I'm surprised the guards didn't tell you that it's criminal damage or something like that. You probably need to hire your own solicitor and sue them yourself. That's been my experience of it.
Thanks, Jim. So there's a discussion going on around the chat around ivy and how it supports lots of important wildlife. So that's really interesting. And thanks so much for coming in on that, guys. A question for Jim. People on the ground have no support from the state when trying to protect our environment. Do we lobby politicians? I know we do. So I can answer that one. And Jim, I know you know that we do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, look, from the top down, politicians are important. You've got to get them on side, got to influence them, got to make them understand the importance of things. Well, and I'll give you a really small, old story about this. When we went to take over Ardenwood, and Westmeath County Council were absolutely brilliant towards us, as were their property manager. Couldn't say enough good things about them. But we made a presentation to the local area committee of the council as part of our proposal to take over that woodland. And one of the councillors had lived beside it all his life and had just regarded it as shrubbery, bit of wasteland. And they himself and his friends used to play in there as kids and never knew the value of it or the importance of it, or that it was a fragment of this tiny fraction left. And to be fair, when we explained it to them, they got it and they went out of their way to help us to do everything we could. And they've continued to do so. And we're finding the same in Westmeath, around St. John's Wood. Local councillors are absolutely brilliant. Once you sit down and talk to them and make them understand, and I don't make them understand sounds wrong, but just explain where you're coming from, why it's important. And at the end of the day, they're people like you and me mostly, you know. So, you know, if you can get your point across, it helps hugely. So absolutely, at a political level, at kind of top-down level, we need to make a difference. But garnering support in your own local community, getting a movement going locally makes a huge difference as well, because generally they don't want to go against activated communities, you know, mobilized communities. So that's one of the biggest things you can do. And like, I would like to say to you, contact us and we'll give you all the support in the world as well. But we're spread so thin ourselves. And Karen will say this to you as well. Every organization in IEN is spread too thin. We could all do with, I certainly know we could do with about 10 times as many staff, 10 times the budget. I myself, I'm a volunteer. I'm here on my lunch as well. So, you know, we depend on people to volunteer and help us. It's the only way we keep going, you know. So we can share our knowledge, share our expertise as much as possible, help people as much as possible. But at the end of the day, we can't do it all, and we can't do it all across the whole country.
Okay, there is a question for you, Jim, around ivy. Ivy, I can't really find the original question. If somebody wants to raise their hand and come in and pose the question for Jim.
Well, if I even answer the common question, should we take ivy off trees? No. So if you have a particular tree, an individual tree, maybe in a built-up area or in a heavily used area where it's in danger of falling, even taking the ivy off it is probably not going to give it more than another few years. Ivy is hugely important for biodiversity. It's hugely important for pollinators. Berries and flowers on it are available at all times of the year when other food and pollen isn't available. It provides a huge amount of cover, and it's completely natural that ivy grows up trees. So I would say, unless there's a really exceptional circumstance, you should always leave the ivy on a tree. There's no good reason to take it off. Okay. That hopefully hit the question, whatever it was.
Hopefully. I'm sure we'll see in the chat if it didn't. I know there were a couple of points around rhododendron as well. Someone said that, you know, it's hard to view rhododendron as an invasive species because there's a festival celebrating rhododendrons that people put the purple flowers. Yeah,
there's probably festivals to celebrate bullfighting and all sorts of things in all parts of the world, so it doesn't make it a good thing. And I know where you're coming from, and it's a beautiful plant, and there's so many varieties, and people plant them in their gardens and they have fantastic flowers. But unfortunately, in the wild, it's an absolute brute. And it's causing major damage to a lot of our woodlands, as is cherry laurel. And I'll speak even from my own experience with cherry laurel. When I spend a lot of time cutting it down, it's full of cyanic acid. It's effectively cyanide. It's bad stuff. So you know, these things might be okay in domestic settings. They may be okay in your garden. Unfortunately, when they escape into the wild, into our forests, they are hugely damaging.
Thanks, Jim, for addressing that. There's one technical question. I have old ash trees around my house and think they have ash dieback. Will I have to knock them? And thank you. Brilliant webinar from Una O'Dwyer.
Thanks very much. What I would say is the instinct a lot of people have had, and local authorities have had it, and the Forestry Service had it, is let's cut everything down. If we cut everything down, we'll never find the trees that are resistant to this disease. So there is some evidence to show that trees are impacted initially and then can struggle through and survive. The bottom line is I can't give you a straight answer on that. They may die. They may need to be felled, especially if they pose a danger. They may get into a dangerous condition before they are fully dead, or they may recover and be fine. Or one of them may recover and the rest die, and vice versa. I really can't give you an answer. All I can say to you is you'll have to keep an eye on them. And if they die back quite substantially, you're probably going to have to get a tree surgeon to take a look at them and decide whether they need to come down or not. If they're in a wild area where nobody goes, let them fall themselves, if they're not a danger to anybody, and that at least gives them the opportunity to, you know, fully fight the disease or fully succumb to it. But otherwise, if they're, you know, if they're in your garden, if they're next to a wall, if they're where people will be, you'll have to get a tree surgeon to actually look at them individually.
Okay. Thanks. We probably only have time for a couple more questions. One is, do you know of any grants that can be used to help encourage natural biodiversity and conservation? My family owns some land near a protected woodland area. If it was financially viable, we'd love to see the land doing some good in protecting natural ecosystems or helping to regenerate the land with native species. Do you have any recommendations on where information can be found on supportive grants and researching?
So I guess it obviously depends on any schemes you're already in. So if you are farmers, if you own farmland, you might look at the acre scheme or some of the other similar schemes around. There's also the Native Woodland scheme, which is there both for the protection and preservation of existing woodlands and to plant new native woodlands. It would be absolutely worth your while looking into those. You can register the neighbouring woodland. I don't know if you own it yourselves or not, or know the owner. You can register it as a seed stand and either get a contract with a nursery or possibly grow the trees yourself from your own neighbourhood, get them certified as their origin, and they can actually be used in forestry grant schemes. So Native Woodland scheme would seem like a really good one for you, both for the existing woodland and for any areas that you want to allow to become woodland.
Okay, from Rebecca O'Flynn, should these topics be covered in schools so we educate kids on woodlands, water, farming, etc. early on so they can support and drive change into the future?
100%, absolutely. And it's not just woodlands, it's all the environmental issues. Bring back nature tables, all that sort of stuff. Kids should be going on nature walks very, very regularly from schools. You know, and I found it amazing myself. Even I've asked sort of really experienced gardeners if they would recognize an elm tree, and they wouldn't, you know. So there's very, very simple stuff like that you can be shown. And, you know, for me, myself personally, you know, we were taken on a walk as primary school children by a man from Kerry, our school teacher, and he knew all the trees and he told us them all. And I just retained most of them at the time, I remember. And that's partially why I grew a great love of trees and forests and stuff like that, because of one afternoon spent in a forest park, you know, with a footballing man from Kerry. So, you know, it's a great opportunity to give people a sense of the importance of this, a sense of just that, you know, how incredible nature is. And most people will walk through a parkland or, you know, on a tarmac footpath, and they won't stray off and they won't see things. And if they see things, they won't recognize them or know how important they are. Even a little bit of that injected into somebody's life could only be beneficial. Certainly would benefit the environment because they will care about it. But, you know, the benefits of nature for people, especially stressful lives these days, all that sort of stuff, is just huge. And that couldn't possibly be any harm for kids who are probably stressed as well, stressed with exams, under far more pressure to do well than we ever were as kids. So look, for me, there's no argument against it whatsoever. This absolutely should be maybe not necessarily a part of the curriculum on which they have to do exams, but just, you know, an hour a week that they get to take a break from the indoors.
Thanks, Jim. Two final questions. One is from Patricia Doyle. I have 20 acres that are designated SAC adjacent to a protected raised bog. Would it be a good idea to plant some trees or leave it alone?
If it's an SAC, you would actually have to get a written permission from the National Park Service via the minister to plant trees on it anyway. So the best thing you can do is engage with your local National Parks Ranger and talk to them about the suitability of that. Most bogs naturally would have had a ring of bog woodland around them anyway. So there might be some value in actually trying to put that back in place, especially if the land has currently been farmed. But you'll have to talk to National Parks first and see if it's appropriate, if they would approve it, and you need to get their buy-in before you go doing anything else. You know.
Okay, and the very final question from Karen Mahon. The maps on GeoHive, are the 6-inch maps the oldest available?
I think the 6-inch ones are the oldest available on there. Once you kind of establish something on GeoHive, there's a early and late edition 6-inch, and then I think there's a 25-inch, if I recall correctly. After that, you're probably talking about going onto the Trinity website and trying to find some of the older scanned-in maps from the 1600s and stuff like that. There was a civil survey done in the 1650s. So basically after the Cromwellian invasion, they wanted to divide the country up. They mapped and documented everything, including woodlands, because they had a financial value for when they were divvying up the spoils of war. So there's an awful lot of information like that there. You can't necessarily get really, really clear information from that all the time. You won't find that the woodland is of the same name, or that it's described clearly, or it's drawn on a map. And sometimes they're quite vague. But you're into kind of deeper research. Once you go off the GeoHive website, you're into a bit more elbow grease involved, I'm afraid.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I think that was the very last question we had. Lots of very positive feedback, Jim. Lots of thanks for sharing your knowledge and for the informative talk. And so I hope, well, special thanks to Jim for this afternoon. I really enjoyed that as well myself. And I hope that you'll all be able to join us next week as we dive into, pardon the pun, dive into marine biodiversity with Dr. Donal Griffin and Regina Klassen. So I'll go ahead and share a link to the chat, the Eventbrite registration details in case you haven't signed up yet. But very heartfelt thanks to you, Jim. I found that really interesting, and I know a lot of other folks did too. And thanks everybody for joining us, and hope you found today useful. And I would absolutely encourage, I know we were talking about some small personal actions and community actions that everyone can take in your local communities, and getting involved with groups like the Native Woodland Trust and other of our IEN members, to work together collectively to try to address some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of the biodiversity and climate emergencies. We would also very strongly urge you to make your views known, and work together to make sure that policymakers and others hear from us, that we care about these issues. And one opportunity to do that is to make a submission to the Citizens Assembly on biodiversity loss, which is happening now. And they're taking public submissions until the end of November. So you can share your views and let them know why biodiversity and nature is important to you, your family, and your community. So thanks so much, Jim, and thanks to you all for joining us.